to the second in our installment now of a regular program we have at the Ayn Rand Center UK of a weekly discussion of Leonard Peikoff essays. And this time we're talking about, in particular, the theme that we're talking about here, this one, the philosophical survival value of great but philosophically bad art. A challenging theme to a lot of objectivists, a challenging theme to me, and so we're particularly privileged today to have as a guest Lisa VanDamme, the fountainhead behind VanDamme Academy, a brilliant educator and a brilliant expert on literature. Today she's dressed up for her school's Halloween festivities and rather appropriately dressed up as Maleficent because we're talking about great art that can have a malevolent theme and still be of tremendous value to you. So welcome, Lisa, and thank you for joining us.
I will dress down for the rest. But I did think that once I took the horns off, it looked vaguely Russian, and that since we'll be talking about Anna Karenina, that seems to fit too.
Yeah, it is dark.
But this is a serious discussion of something that means a great deal to me, so I will take off my, my Halloween costume.
And as you do that, I'll set this up a little bit.
Okay, sounds good.
Dr. Peikoff gave this in 1997. That's right, 24 years ago at a Lyceum conference in 1997. And he had just published his work on his essay as course, later to be published on 8 Great Plays, where he talks about the important value of plays from Sophocles, Shakespeare, Corneille. And later, a couple of years later, he'd do a talk series on poetry. So this was part of Dr. Peikoff's effort to get objectivists to expand their horizons when it comes to great art, because so many objectivists, they'll read Ayn Rand's theory of aesthetics, they'll read her preferences in aesthetics, particularly literature or music, and that will characterize all that they then thereafter consider or read. And Peikoff regards this as a limiting thing. And so in this essay, he's talking about I'm going to use a fancy word here, the psychoepistemological value to our own consciousness of studying great art. And the examples he uses are very interesting. Dostoevsky, the 19th century Russian novelist, known for his powerful, if dark, psychological portrayals in his stories, and Leo Tolstoy, and in particular here, the novel Anna Karenina, the story, a tragic story of the woman who falls in love even though she's married, and she loses her child, and in the end, of course, there's going to be all kinds of spoilers here, so I may as well just get to it. Anna Karenina throws herself under the oh-so-symbolic trains in that novel at the end and kills herself. So there are, Tolstoy is a fatalist, a determinist, and Dostoevsky deeply religious. And so both of these novelists have themes that are profoundly anti-objectivist, and yet Dr. Peikoff is asking us to take a look at them and actually get this value from even dark and philosophically opposed to objectivism kind of art. How does this process of mental stylization, is what he calls it, this capacity to look at the world through essentials, how does that get enhanced in us through the process of appreciating great art?
So I love a lot of the kind of metaphors and analogies that Leonard uses in this lecture, which I did attend live. I did know him personally at the time, so it's hard for me to recall how much of my own feeling about literature comes from conversations we had at the time, or how much directly from that lecture, because so much of my personal passions and life career path have come as a consequence of his lectures on art. So this one is was formative for me, whether it came directly from the lecture, it came from him regardless. So one of the terms he uses that I use a lot when I'm talking about the value of literature is the Xray vision that it gives you into the world. There may be other metaphors that work for it too, but the way I think of it is, in a great work of art, everything is so intently stylized that the concretes that you observe come to integrate and subsume broad abstractions. So there are intense values contained within the concretes that you're observing. And the artist has done such a good job of, discarding all non-essentials, pointing you towards what's important. Leonard uses like the term monomania or obsession. Obsession was the word used there. Obsessively focused on directing your attention to values that they want to highlight. And so that's the feeling and experience of reading a great work of literature. So then, ideally, if you've experienced that again and again and again through great works of art, you translate that process to your own life experience. And I definitely believe this is the effect that literature has on an individual's psyche or psychoepistemology, that when you go back into the real world, which is much more chaotic and indecipherable on the surface, and but as he says, it's only on the surface that it's indecipherable. There are themes and there is meaning and there are values underneath it all. And we leave these great works of literature with this sort of Xray vision where we can look out at our own world, and we've habituated that ability to clear away the non-essentials, see what really matters, and see the values that are reflected in the experiences
So
that
it's
we're having
not
in life.
so it's not so much the values or themes of the artist, but the act of a great work of art is to focus and essentialize on, focus on certain features that
Yeah.
help us look at things more essentially.
Yeah.
And so it's a training of the mind, really. You can read
Yeah.
a book about epistemology, you could read a book about aesthetics, but
Mhm.
it's a different experience than experiencing the art
Yeah.
concretely.
Yeah.
An
It's like
analogy
immersion. There's that, learning a language versus language immersion. This
that's
is like stylized universe immersion. You're immersed in the experience of it, and then you carry that away to everyday life.
In another course, Understanding Objectivism, Dr. Peikoff has this great analogy. He says,
Mhm.
you can learn philosophy, but that's not uh, learning how to use it as a tool in your own mind,
Mhm.
psychoepistemologically. And
Mhm.
so he gives another great analogy. He says, you can read a cookbook, the best cookbook in the world. You
Yeah.
could take a course on cooking, the best course in cooking on the world. That still doesn't make you a great cook.
Yeah.
You've got to go into the kitchen, use that cookbook, actually cook and practice. And so, in effect, what you're saying is that it's reading great literature allows us to cook, in effect, to
Mhm.
practice our mind
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, with this. Wow,
With
fascinating.
that value orientation. I would like to add two other things about it that he doesn't so much stress in this lecture, but I am certain he would agree with. One is that when we're looking at Tolstoy or Dostoevsky on the in the big picture, on the grand scale, then we disagree. We might disagree with him philosophically, right?
Right,
Most people listening to this probably do.
right.
However, they are both geniuses. And in the course of elaborating their themes, they are going to identify, pinpoint, highlight a countless things that are absolute truth. So I feel like people forget that sometimes, that if you're reading a novel whose broad theme you disagree with philosophically, that doesn't mean there's nothing within it that you're not going to gain that's absolutely clarifying and ingenious and brilliant and wholly true. So I just want to make that quick differentiation.
Oh, wow, that's a really great point.
Mhm.
Now, as an educator,
Mhm.
particularly as an educator in literature,
Mhm.
do you have insight here? Have you actually seen this process occur in students?
Seeing the process of gaining this vision. Oh,
Yes, X-ray vision, this
yeah.
this a greater acuity and seeing essentials in our complex world.
100%. It's a bit difficult to make this really concrete, but I'm going to do my best. So I definitely think that the literature curriculum at VanDamme Academy is one of the most important and formative aspects of their education. And part of it, so there's this X-ray vision, there's the truths they're going to uncover. The other thing I wanted to say, which I can connect to this question, is that the mere scale of thinking is something that is stretching you, that is allowing you to grow, that is introducing you to questions that wouldn't have occurred to you had you not read this novel. So let's put aside and forget about whether the answers are correct. Simply being exposed to the questions is giving you a truth and is expanding your capacity to think and to value and to live. So anytime, let's see, what's something that I would teach. Well, this one is not so false, but it's the first one that comes to mind because I'm teaching it right now. So I'll just, as an example, I'm reading right now with my 7th grade students the play The Romantics, and it's an adorable play by Rostand, and it starts with 2 young lovers whispering across a wall because their fathers are feuding and they're not allowed to be together. And then we get to the next scene and they're just totally full of themselves, and they're romantics in the sense that they think they are Romeo and Juliet, and it's so over the top and it's so absurd, campy and kind of cringy almost. And then you discover that their fathers orchestrated the whole thing. They're not feuding at all. They want to unite the estates. So there was like reverse psychology. We'll tell these kids they can't be together, and then that's the thing that will most surely make them want to be together. It's an amazing play. But so the theme of this play that I'm discussing with 12 and 13-year-olds, they will see over time is, well, what does it really mean to be a romantic? So after the 2 young lovers discovered that this was all a plot and they're just dupes and they were puppets on their father's fingers, then they have to say, so, are we really in love or not? Was it just that we were caught up in this, all the drama and melodrama and romance of it? Or is there real love underneath that? Well, sorry, spoiler again, but Rostand is the greatest romantic there is in my head. So, of course, his theme is ultimately going to be that true love is real and a romantic vision of the world is sensible and possible. But just think about that for a second. 12 and 13-year-olds contemplating the question and being exposed to a rich working out of what it means to be a romantic. It's not something they're going to end up talking about on the playground if they weren't exposed to it in this work of literature. But if they're exposed to it in the class, they do end up going off. In fact, I'm sorry for this I just have to give one hilarious story as an aside. One of my students was telling a teacher in the hall today about the plot of this play, and another teacher walked by and said, "Is this an appropriate subject of conversation for school?" Having no idea, thinking this was like somebody's personal life that he was talking about at school. So they do talk about it even outside of class. Anyway, so the point is that if they're exposed to a question like that, well, over the course of at least their 2 years with me, they read about 20 novels and plays of very different themes and very different ideas. And they've, dived deep into them and really contemplated them. So when they go off to high school, one of the things that they will say to me when they come back that I've always found very charming is they'll meet somebody and say, that person didn't go to VanDamme Academy, but they're totally a VanDamme Academy type. And I am always like, what does that mean? I want to know what a VanDamme Academy, and for them, a VanDamme Academy type is somebody really interested in the world, who's very motivated to learn and has this sort of value orientation, has the capacity to be observant and see meaning in things. So yes, I think it very, very deeply affects them.
Wow, that is fascinating. A VanDamme type student. I love that. And they're the kind of student who can think, look, see things in essentials, has this Xray vision. That is fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Well, I guess I have to hear.
Well, it's funny when you said that. I'm sorry. I just realized that even thinking of someone in terms of, well, that's a VanDamme Academy type is doing the very thing.
Exactly. They're thinking in terms,
we're talking
about. In terms of essentials. Exactly. Yeah. Oh, that's brilliant. Oh, that's great. I guess at this point, I have to sort of make a confession here.
Okay.
I really found Dostoevsky's work, and I have read a great deal of it, very powerful. Just as much as I disagree with his philosophy, I find the way he reveals even a twisted psychology to be fascinating. I find a greater, despite his religious beliefs, right? He's definitely opposed to reason and science, and that's in effect what's screwing up Raskolnikov. Is
Mhm.
the Western nihilism is affecting him, and that's what makes him in effect a
Oh yeah.
nihilist
Yeah.
at the end of the day. But
Yeah.
even though I strongly disagree with the theme there, I
You can
can
see
set
that.
that aside much more easily with Dostoevsky and be taken in to this powerful portrait, this sort of dark, chamber of horrors that he constructs so powerfully
Mhm.
about the inside of Raskolnikov's mind. I just find it he can turn an axe murderer into an interesting character,
Yeah.
which is absolutely astonishing to me. At the beginning, I'm horrified by the guy, but then I'm more and more and progressively drawn in to
Mhm.
his complex psychology.
Yeah.
So it makes it a lot easier for me, for example, to read Crime and Punishment than, say, Anna Karenina. And
Okay.
it's not, when I read Anna Karenina, it's not the social situation she finds herself in. Obviously, in
Mhm.
19th century Russia, a woman who's a married woman,
Mhm.
especially an aristocratic married woman who falls in love with someone else, and
Mhm.
she herself is tormented by the guilt of this, extramarital love that she's having. I have sympathy with her plight, and
Mhm.
that doesn't prevent me from sympathizing with her.
Mhm.
It's Tolstoy's
Mhm.
seeming insistence that she's trapped by her fate. And
Mhm.
again and again, he shows us in various ways how she's utterly doomed by
Mhm.
fate, and there's
Mhm.
really nothing she can do about it. Now, I preferred, Count Vronsky to her husband, who's a dweeb and just awful and a social metaphysician.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, was Vronsky really worth it? Was he willing to take her away to America? Say no. At
Mhm.
the end of
Mhm.
the day, he really wasn't. And
No.
so I don't. It's my inability to buy into Tolstoy's premises
Yeah.
that make it so difficult for me to read Anna Karenina.
Sure.
Is there something you can do to help orient a person like me better towards novels like that so I can get the value out of it?
I would say probably, but I don't think it's necessary. That's my feeling. So you just said you read and enjoy Dostoevsky. You don't like Tolstoy. Well, each of us is, when it comes to art, we're all going to have, aspects of our psychology, of our life experience, of our personal values that make us more drawn to or feel more alienated by different styles and different works of literature. So I'll give you an example that might be some consolation to you. One of my favorite works of literature by far is Rostand's Chanticleer. I just think it is magnificently beautiful. I want to do it for my Read With Me program, but I love it so much. It
I have to
intimidates
interject.
me.
I love that
Oh,
play.
you do too. Good.
It's like apart
Okay,
from
good.
Cyrano, it's like my second favorite play of all
I
time.
thought, I mean, I went through a period where I thought, I'm not even sure which of these are
Right?
better.
It's such a great.
It really spoke to me at a time I needed its precise theme. So it's very special to me. So guess who does not love that play? Our friend Leonard Peikoff.
Oh.
He doesn't like it at all. He won't even finish it. I mean, I think he's read it before, but I led a discussion group and invited him to be a part of it. And after Act One, he said, "It's farm animals."
Right.
He
Right.
just couldn't do it.
Right, it's animals, right?
It's farm animals. He couldn't buy into it. It doesn't speak to him. Well, I don't judge him morally for not caring
Right.
about the work of fiction.
Well, he's taught me not to judge people morally for their aesthetic taste.
That's a good point. But I do stand behind the value of that play, and I think I could convince a lot of people to love it. But anyway, the point is, sometimes it's going to be something that's you're not saying Anna Karenina is bad literature. You're saying there are aspects of it that really are alienating to you, and therefore it's not what you
That's
want.
exactly it. When he gives us the initial description of Karenin, I'm impressed with Tolstoy's skill. I do not read Russian at all, unlike French. I don't read Russian at all, and so I miss all the poetry. But nonetheless, I can appreciate the power and the economy of his stylization of the character of Karenin. So I do accept that Tolstoy is a great artist, and there are great moments. And I definitely, like you say, there is wisdom there too. Tolstoy is full of things out of context. I say, oh yeah, that's true. Oh yeah, that's true. And I can even say, my God, how powerful this moment was, or how powerful that moment was.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I when I sit down and try and enjoy it, it's not like other novels that I enjoy but disagree with, where
Yeah.
I can actually get into it, and it
Yeah.
doesn't kind of put me to sleep.
Right. Right. Well, I think there's a good possibility I would not, even if I got to have a chapter by chapter book group with you, I would not be able to talk you into liking that any better. It might just be, so its particular values might strike you in a personal way that's so offensive to you that you're just not going to be able to do. I use the term suspend philosophic disbelief. That's what I ask people
That's a great term.
It's very helpful because especially if you're you have a strong philosophy of your own, you're going into a work of literature, it's very hard not to evaluate it philosophically right from the outset. And then that can make you be too quickly dismissive of it. But you're not doing that. So you've already satisfied what was Leonard's purpose in giving this lecture. You're not reading only Ayn Rand's novels. You are recognizing and allowing for the value of great works of literature that are not philosophically aligned with yours. So then you have to also allow yourself personal preference and say, I'm just not going to read Tolstoy. It doesn't do it for me.
Right. On a much smaller scale, there are a number of books that I feel sort of the same I do about Anna Karenina, where there's some skill there. But obviously the skill is inferior often to Tolstoy's skill.
Okay.
But take William Golding's Lord of the Flies.
Oh, okay.
It has such a horrific theme, as far as I'm concerned, that it gets the very power of Golding's prose gets me more angry. It's as though he's particularly skilled in showing me the very opposite of my view of humanity.
Yeah.
And so I almost my anger gets built up worse and worse because the art is strong enough, but the theme is so awful. That combination actually has a negative impact on me. And I want to I'm going to tell you, I want to throw the Lord of the Flies right across the room to hit the wall.
Well, Anna Karenina, which I have here, is the only book that I have very literally thrown across the room. So I can sympathize with
that. Actually call it the most evil novel ever written?
Yeah, but so it was, do you remember the horse race scene?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I mean, you build up such an attachment to this horse, such an excitement for the event, and then, spoiler, the horse falls, injures itself, and he has to shoot it. And of course, it's all, there's that obsession again, metaphor. There's a metaphor for the whole novel. But it was so successful at getting me so attached and involved in that scene that ending to it was just so maddening. There was another scene when somebody was going to propose, but he was too timid, and then he started talking about mushrooms instead, and then decided he couldn't follow up a conversation about mushrooms with a proposal, so he didn't end up proposing at all. And that was another one of those just miserable fatalistic moments that is so maddening. So I sympathize with that completely. But I also, for me personally, Tolstoy, some of the sheer individual passages that bring like love, or just even some of the kind of idyllic scenes that he describes, there's so much within it that it's enough for me to feel very absorbed and drawn in.
And I guess I'll admit that Dr. Peacock points out in this the moment when Anna has to part from her son, because going with Vronsky makes her lose her son, of course, in 19th century Russia. And it's a very powerful scene. It's very moving. Yeah. He says he can't not cry with it. I am definitely still moved by it. I'll grant you that. It is a moving scene. It is moving because Anna is a good person, and she is having to give up her child for this love. So it's so powerful that I think you're missing a heart if you can't be moved by that scene,
Yeah. Well, can I give you a specific example from Anna Karenina? Okay. Yeah. So I think I may have shared this passage in a lecture. So you may have heard this before and you've read this, but I just want to, under the theme of Tolstoy's power and that there's going to be truth even within this novel that is so philosophically abhorrent in so many ways. So this is a description of Levin, who's in love with Kitty and sees her at the ice skating rink from a distance. And it says, he knew she was there by the rapture and the terror that seized on his heart. She was standing talking to a lady at the opposite end of the ground. There was apparently nothing striking either in her dress or her attitude. But for Levin, she was as easy to find in that crowd as a rose among nettles. Everything was made bright by her. And then he says, there's a little more, and then he says, he walked down for a long while, avoiding looking at her as at the sun, but seeing her as one does the sun without looking.
Oh,
I mean, come on.
wow.
If you can write one sentence like that last
Right.
the entirety of this fat novel, I'll read it just for that.
Okay. If there are moments like that, then I guess you've sold it on me. In fact, you sold me on rereading Anna Karenina.
Oh, wow. Okay. So that's all I can do with people who are really resistant to this sort of literature is, point their attention to where I think the value lies. But you are still entitled to your personal preferences.
Uh-huh. Well, you really are, and I just want to say personally, your lectures on literature I've heard them more than once at conferences and on tape, and they bring tears to my eyes. There's something I really wish that when I was in school, I'd had a literature teacher like you.
So do I.
You really would have inspired my love of literature a lot earlier. So are there as a teacher, though, are there other works like this that you can recommend, perhaps philosophically questionable or worse?
Well, worse. Well, there are Tolstoy short stories that I absolutely love that are absolutely frightening in terms of the content of what happens and the things and the themes. So the Kreutzer Sonata, for example, or Father Sergius is another one I really like.
See, I've not read any of his short stories, and he's so famous for them. I've only read the big novels, Anna Kay and War and Peace.
Short stories might be, if you're going to try Tolstoy again, short stories might be the way to start, so you don't have to commit so much of your life to
Right.
the work. And they're very powerful and very beautifully written. So in terms of a recommended list, as you know, I think, but I can share here, I have something called the Read With Me app. And in the purpose of the Read With Me app was, I was to take works of literature that are not easily accessible, that people aren't, they might pick up a popular novel, but more and more people are not picking up the classics. They weren't given any guidance in school. They don't know what to read. They don't know how to approach it. And so the idea of the program was to sort of handhold people through the process, not have a reading group where we just meet and discuss it, not have something where I give them a summary at the end of the book, but a chapter by chapter. All right, here's what we've seen. Here's what's important. I give them a summary in terms of essentials that's meant to capture the spirit of that chapter. And then I give brief commentaries on the chapter, trying to draw their attention to what needs to be integrated just from within that chapter itself, and then build inductively and hierarchically as we go through the novel to an understanding of the theme overall. So that was the idea of the program, because I know I wasn't taught, I didn't have a good literature teacher until I had Dr. Peikoff's 8 Great Plays. So I know that people haven't been given this training, and that it does require training to learn how to extract the value and the meaning from a great work of literature. So that's the process that I take. And then the other thing is that the Read With Me program is meant to provide a curated list. Anything that I cover in that app is something I consider very worthwhile, not because I agree with it philosophically, but because I think it has the scope of thought and the precision of theme and the quality of writing that make it very worthwhile and very life enhancing, to go back to the theme of that lecture, very life enhancing if you take the time to read it. So what are some things in the Read With Me app? I do cover Crime and Punishment. Kreutzer Sonata is in there. I also have a short story by Dostoevsky that I adore called White Nights. Um, and then other things like I really love George Eliot and Silas Marner. I love Middlemarch, but it's really substantial, so it'd be hard. I'd have to devote a year to it. But maybe someday I'll do that one. But Silas Marner is an absolutely beautiful short novel. So anyway, that's for a list. Go to the Read With Me app, and that will, anything that's there comes with a ringing endorsement and a lot of personal guidance from me.
Well, thank you. That's a great resource for people to have.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully we can put a link on this when, in the comments so that anyone can link right to it if they listen to this discussion. I'd just like to say that the point in general, I think I've always been in agreement with. I mean, Ayn Rand's own favorite literature, Hugo and Dostoevsky, she said were the greatest novelists who had the biggest influence on her. And yet it was always clear to me that she wasn't a Christian, a Christian socialist like Hugo, or a Christian anti-socialist like Dostoevsky, and nor did she have the sense of life of Dostoevsky at all. And so I realized early on that it really didn't, that what Ayn Rand was responding to in art was not so much philosophical agreement, but the nature of romantic art as such. But it extends beyond just romantic art. There's naturalistic art, which is also of great value, even if we disagree with it. And there are a lot of good examples from that. Dr. Peikoff didn't give much credit to American literature at all. Is there anything in American? I myself enjoyed The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. I myself enjoy some of the poetry of Emily Dickinson, which I may not metaphysically agree with, but I can see the power of her poetry. Is there other American literature that you can, because he doesn't much care for American literature.
Sure. Well, let's see. I don't read a lot of American literature myself, in part because I know, to the extent that my students or anybody who participates in the Read With Me app, that is the exposure that they will have had. So they might have read Lord of the Flies or Steinbeck or The Great Gatsby. None of these are favorites of mine anyway. But I'm trying to think if there's,
even in Gatsby there's some good writing, right?
Sure.
I mean, it's Gatsby. I agree with you. It's not a big favorite of mine, but there are times with Fitzgerald where I can see, well, he's a good writer. He knows how to string words together in a beautiful way. But Steinbeck, even if I disagree with his politics intensely, he is obviously a powerful. His speeches are powerful. His plots are powerful. He's really a good writer.
Well, this is where, even though I would agree with you in principle, I don't ever want to read another Steinbeck novel. I feel like I'm just stuck in the 19th century, because there's something about the 19th century sense of life in literature.
Apparently superior.
It just feels, it resonates with me so much more. So I just don't read anything very contemporary. Nothing comes to mind as something I'd want to. I mean, there's a lot in I read The Miracle Worker. I don't know where to put that in the canon of classic literature, but The Miracle Worker is one of my top favorites, and it's part of the VanDamme Academy
relatively contemporary American work.
That is a contemporary American work. So it's funny because I feel like so much of my ambition with people is to get them to read things that on the surface are inaccessible to them. So I tend not to promote a lot of the things that I still consider. I love the novel To Kill a Mockingbird. That is a part of the 7th grade canon. The Miracle Worker, not American, but very accessible. I love Radigan plays. Dr. Peikoff talks about those in one of his lectures. The Browning version is a favorite, and The Winslow Boy. So, and there are other Americans. but no, mostly I'm
But
in
you
the
know,
middle.
it's with American literature, even with English literature in the 20th century, it's the popular literature. It's a couple of Mickey Spillane novels or detective stories, but
Mhm.
this doesn't give me the same effect that great literature does. It's not Rostand or Hugo or even Dostoevsky for me.
Yeah,
It's a different level. I mean, it's not to say that I really do like a couple of Mickey Spillane novels, and I really do enjoy murder mysteries.
yeah,
But
yeah,
they strike me more as mental bubble gum than a
yeah,
profound
yeah,
ability to see things in essentials or profoundly moving.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, there's that phrase that Ayn Rand has about Hugo where she says reading Hugo feels like entering a cathedral. And that is the feeling that I like to get from a work of literature, is to feel like life has deep and profound meaning and values exist on a very grand scale. And that's something that feels present in so much of 19th century literature.
And you
Um,
get that from one of the things about his great play talk was that you can really get that despite profound philosophical differences. Our
mhm,
ability to sympathize with the idealism and fury of Antigone,
mhm,
it
mhm.
transcends our ability to, for example, relate to the
Right.
moral code that she's enforcing, that she thinks she needs to enforce.
Yeah.
We still walk away moved by her
Mhm,
plight and impressed by her character. And this
mhm.
is a 2,400-year-old play.
Yeah. 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 Well, I have here, I can turn the camera and show you my wall of dead white males over there. And who I have there are Ibsen, Hugo, Tennyson, and Tolstoy. And
Wow.
the quote, each one has a quote either from within their work or about them under it. And the Tolstoy quote is, Tolstoy is like the rest of us, but a different height. Not superhuman, but the most human of mankind. I love that quote, whether we're talking about Tolstoy or just a great writer in
Great
general,
artist in general,
a
yeah.
great artist in general, to be at a different height. I mean, I think the difference that you're describing is, you said, I enjoy reading a Mickey Spillane novel. You don't come away taller, you don't come away
That's it.
bigger from having read it. You come away with a feeling of enjoyment, but
Or
with
with broader vision, which a
broader
smaller
vision.
person can give us, right?
Right. So that's the feeling when I get into a work of literature that really resonates with me, and I feel expanded by it, because if it's a truly great work of literature, the person is a genius. They're not an ordinary, they're not of the ordinary scope of human possibility. They're a genius. They're much more observant, much more articulate, much more deep souled than most of us average people. So if I get to inhabit their mind for a little while, then what I'm getting to experience is looking at the world through their ingenious, brilliant, powerful, insightful eyes. So I don't come away Tolstoy philosophically or in terms of stature after I
Right.
read his novels, but I do feel stretched. I always feel stretched by something that is really
Taller with greater vision. That's a
taller.
great
Yeah,
image. I
yeah,
love that quote. I
yeah.
really do. You brought up Tennyson, and the at the Ayn Rand Institute page, they connect this lecture with a couple of lectures he gave on poetry into a
Yes,
single course
yes,
a couple of years later.
yeah,
And Tennyson, I think he stresses in both places, is his all-time favorite
yes,
poet.
yes.
Um, do you have any tips for us in terms of poetry?
Sure. Well, also in the Read With Me app, there are two things available. One is an analysis and a reading of the poem Rizpah, which is one of the poems he
Right,
talks
he
about.
mentions that
And
as the poem he can't really do in public for fear of crying.
that's right. Well, my introduction to that poem was at my house. I had a group of people who would meet and talk about literature on a regular basis, and he participated in this group, and we were exchanging favorite poems. Well, at the time, to be frank, I think my favorite poems were like Edgar Guest poems. If you strike a thorn a rose, keep a going. If it hails or if it snows, keep a going. Like sing-songy, things that I'd learned from teaching them. Maybe Rudyard Kipling's If was the most profound, which is one of my very favorites, not to discredit Kipling. But things that were accessible on first reading were things that I knew at that time.
Right.
So he brought and read to us Rizpah, and yes, he did cry. And that was an enormously powerful and eye-opening experience for me, because we've all had the experience of sitting down with a poem, looking at it, having our eyes sort of read the words and pass over it, but not coming away with a lot on the first time. And there's a real process that you have to go through because of the density of value that they're offering, because they're really making careful use of language to call upon all of the resource of it, the connotations of it, and the sound and the flow and the rhythm, and all of those things are being used. So it's not always going to be transparent like conversation. Sometimes it's going to take a little bit of work. So Rizpah is in that category, and it will forever be one of my favorites. So Rizpah is in the Read With Me app, as is parts of Tennyson's In Memoriam AHH, which is I can't remember, something like 150 page poem in dedication to his best friend. It's extremely moving. It covers basically every aspect of the grieving process or reflections on life that would come from the loss of a loved one that a person could possibly experience. I have not done the complete poem. That is a goal of mine, to at some point have analysis for every stanza, but right now a substantial amount of it is there, so it can get you started.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you can glean just from this conversation that we've had what an invaluable resource Lisa VanDamme is. And I would urge everyone to go check out her talks on, insofar as they're available, on literature, because you will be moved, I promise you, and you will gain insight into how to read and appreciate great literature. And let me just ask Dylan at this point, have we received any super chat questions today?
No, sir, not at this time, but I do want to thank everybody for participating in the normal chat. And we are taking super chat questions.
Are there any interesting questions from regular chat?
Yeah, let me pop in here. So we have a question from Jose, who says, does she agree with James's definition of poetry that Peikoff ended up adopting?
What is that?
Well, I had the chutzpah one day back in the early 90s in Leonard's home to actually pop up my I love poetry. And here's an art where I can actually separate out the content almost completely and appreciate pure style. It occurred to me that all the poetic techniques were all about audibility, the physical sound of the words, and that was the essence. And Leonard's eyes widened, and you can see that whether or not my exact definition, because he modified it, of course, he's a much better philosopher than I am. So I think he had a better definition. But the idea that it is the audibility, and as you point out, in normal conversation, we don't think about the relationship between the meaning of our words and the physical sound. Well, that's all poetry is all about, is having the meaning in some sense reflected by the sound. So I'll give a couple of examples. A bad rhyme, to go back to the poetic techniques. Hold the pickles, hold the lettuce, special orders don't upset us. Well, why should upset us be paired with lettuce as opposed to the pickles? There's no real reason. Now take a good rhyme. And when I found your flesh did not resist, it was the living spirit that I kissed. So that the tension.
What is that from?
Oh, it's from The Marriage by Ivor Winters, an American poet. And it just is such a beautiful rhyme, right? Because the tension created in resist is resolved in kissed. And so those are the words to juxtapose to bring out the meaning. Or to take an Emily Dickinson poem, the first line from about the passing of summer into autumn, so it might be appropriate here. As imperceptibly as grief, the summer lapsed away. Well, you see, the sentence lapses away,
Right.
just like she says, the summer is
Right.
lapsing away. So
Yeah.
when meaning can be reflected in the very sound of the words,
Sure.
that's what poetry is.
Yeah.
Leonard backed up. That's
Yeah.
you know, you
Yeah.
got it. Can I steal that? And
Uh-huh.
so, with modification, it appeared
Uh-huh.
both in the introduction to Anthem and in his poetry course.
Okay,
Uh,
interesting.
Now,
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. With my students, we often do The Lady of Shalott, and I always make the point of showing them, it starts in this dreamy like environment, and it's on either side the river lie, long fields of barley and of rye. It's almost like the line is waving
Right.
like barley, right?
Right.
And then when Lancelot appears, it's a bow shot from the Bowery. He wrote it like
Right.
it appears like a shot, and it's reflected in the sound. I won't agree or disagree with you because I'm not an expert on this by any means. The only thing I'll say is that I really, really love the book Poetry, A Guide to Its Understanding and Enjoyment by Elizabeth Drew. That was a very eye-opening book for me in terms of how poetry works or what gives it quality. So I recommend that to people. And the phrase she uses, which I think I kind of used in conversation a little bit earlier, was that poetry draws on all of the resources of language. So sound, that quality of audibility being one of them, and maybe arguably one of the most important aspects, but that what is unique about poetry is that there are a number of qualities of language that poetry is drawing upon that are not part of ordinary everyday conversation or prose.
Other features aren't normal to prose, but are distinctive to poetry.
Yes. Yeah. So whether it's audibility or, the sounds is the defining feature, I'm not sure, but certainly has to be a very significant.
Well, when it comes to things like economy, I was able to say, well, that can be just as true in prose. I can state really pithy in one sentence, something very, very profound, and it doesn't have meter or rhyme or you wouldn't call it a poem or a piece of a poem, but it still has that extremely economical quality. Yeah. And so those other features, I would say, are potential to prose. And you're absolutely right.
So with the Venn diagram, you're saying that sound is the one that falls outside of it.
And I don't mean to say that prose doesn't take into account sound. Some of the most beautiful prose, and that's lost in translation too. Some of the most beautiful language that begins in American literature, say, can just be haunting and powerful.
Sure. Yeah, well, we call it poetic when
poetic. Right. Ayn Rand's entire small novel, Anthem, is poetic. In a way, it's like a poem, but it's not strict because it doesn't have meter, right? And nor does it have even partial rhyme. But it has the quality of it is that the very language is used to convey meaning, and in that sense, it is poetic, if not an extended poem. And Leonard agreed with that.
Interesting.
But I would point out to him that there were passages in the Fountainhead that could be described as poetic in the same way, but not poems, let's say. Or the introduction to Atlas Shrugged and how the mood is set there so brilliantly. That is poetry. It really is, without being a poem. And so that was the distinction that we drew. Something could be poetic and something could be essentialized and efficient writing without being a poem. That's how we sort of zeroed in on audibility as being the distinct feature.
Got it.
Do we have another question, Dylan?
Yeah, Geo is interested in hearing about the survival value of great but philosophically false visual arts. So painting in particular.
Yeah. There are powerfully done sculptures that don't have a particularly positive view of humanity.
Yes, there's certainly
I don't know is there the similar thing where you could look?
I think so. I mean, I'm not an expert in the visual arts, and I'm trying to, what would come to mind as a painting with a powerful theme that is, that an objectivist would find objectionable? I'm sure there are so many and nothing's coming to mind.
Well, Ayn Rand's favorite visual artist was Vermeer. And she did not
Mhm.
particularly like most of his subject matter, which
Mhm.
are kitchens with this beautiful window on one
Right.
side, and
Right.
usually some worker in the kitchen doing something. And so, but obviously there are other things that Vermeer did.
So there's an exactly parallel, well, not exactly parallel because it's visual, not conceptual, but there's a very parallel aspect of distillation down to an essence. So if you're taking in the work of art as that sort of distillation down to an essence, it is having the same psychoepistemological function um, as literature, just through the visual
I'd
medium.
also throw in, say, Renaissance art that has a religious subject.
Mm-hmm.
Something by Michelangelo or David. We might not agree with the theme that they have in the back of their mind as they're painting the Last Supper or the Sistine Chapel or doing a sculpture of David or Moses. On the
Mm-hmm.
other hand, what a powerful portrait of Moses, what a
Right.
powerful portrait of David. And if you step back abstractly, what a statement about humanity those
Yeah.
sculptures are.
Yeah.
Uh,
And in the lecture, I was just looking back at my notes here, but Leonard Peikoff makes the point that there's something about the style often that contradicts their theme, that it implies a valid philosophy in the method that's contradicted by its own explicit purpose.
in
So
effect, to
that,
be a great artist, you have to think in essentials. And so
yeah,
that right away is something good.
yeah.
Artist is
So,
actually thinking and showing us in essentials,
right.
whatever those essentials we agree with or not. Yeah,
Right. Or if you take something, so if it's that the scenes in Vermeer are prosaic,
right.
there is nothing prosaic about Vermeer's style.
Style at
So
all.
if it's, I don't know what you would say the themes of Vermeer's art are, but if there's any suggestion that that's what she didn't like about it, is that it's presenting life as being sort of prosaic and ordinary, but it's so grandly beautiful in its presentation that defies that purpose, if that was indeed the purpose.
Right, right. Any other questions, Dylan?
Yeah, Duncan with a super chat asks, do you get more value out of binge reading a great book, but less often, or reading consistently for shorter amounts of time each day?
Oh, what a good question.
I have a definite answer to that question.
Go.
Doing the Read With Me program has been the best thing for me in terms of appreciation of literature that I could possibly do. I read each work out loud. So I have to take the time to read it that carefully and that patiently and with that amount of focus. And I don't know about other people. I suspect other people share that even I at this point have challenges with focus when we've got the distractions of devices and everything else around us all the time and lots of things competing for our attention. So having to read it out loud, then on top of that, having to provide what I call a focused summary. So I have to take the chapter and boil it down to an essence while trying to retain not a Cliff's Notes essence where it just tells you what happened, but one that tries to retain the feeling and the spirit of that chapter. I understand these works of literature and enjoy them and appreciate them so much more by doing that. Now, that's not to say everybody should do that. I do think people should do that maybe as an educational practice to try to get themselves up to speed and being able to appreciate literature, but also the Read With Me program guides you through that. But I do, for a great work of literature, I do better reading it in these short sections where I really make sure that I'm paying attention to what happens and really give thought to it and extract the meaning as I go.
And if it matters, I have the same kind of experience. I'm a slow reader, especially of big, complex, or something I'm getting a lot of value out of. I tend to take my time to digest each bit of it and take a breath and to look at it. Now, I don't deny that that's been hard for me sometimes. I've been so drawn. Atlas Shrugged was like that. I was so drawn in from the beginning.
Yeah.
that it just sucked me in and I couldn't stop reading it, at least the first time through.
Right.
I gave myself a breather the second time through. A bit later, when I reread it, I again read it much more slowly to draw out each, squeeze, suck the marrow out of each
Yeah.
paragraph. But it was really hard. Sometimes it's hard to not just be sucked into a
Yeah.
powerful novel.
But
Dostoevsky can do that
that's the key
by the
there
way.
too, that you can go back and reread it as many times as
See,
you
that's the
want.
wonderful thing about literature too. You can just go back. But Dostoevsky can do that too. I
Mm,
have to admit, Notes from the Underground Man and Crime and Punishment
mhm.
sucked me in. I
Yeah.
was drawn so
Yeah.
powerfully by his
Yeah.
prose and characterization, no
Yeah.
matter how weird or horrible the setup. In fact, almost the weirdness and the horror of it was part of the fascinating. How is he going to make me sympathize with his axe murderer? But I
Yeah.
already sort of do. My gosh, he's introspective. He's sensitive. He may be a whim worshiper, as Begoff says, but he's so sensitive and honest and rattled with guilt and
Yeah.
trying to figure this out himself that it sucks you in.
Yeah.
And so you have to go back and reread, and that's why I go back and reread Dostoevsky, because I can then suck out the parts, the value parts that helped suck
Yeah.
me in the first place.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's one of the great things about teaching is that I've been teaching now the same works of literature. Well, I've sort of over time narrowed it down to the ones I consider infallibly successful with seventh and eighth graders. And now that I have for, more than a decade, maybe 15 years, I've been teaching the same works of literature again and again. And it's so much fun when either I notice something reading it the 15th time that I didn't the previous 14 times, which happens all the time, or even better, when they notice something that I didn't notice after 15 readings. Those are my favorite experiences. But yeah, if you do feel yourself drawn into a novel, I wouldn't say, well, pace yourself and make sure you're giving it plenty of focus. Go, just read. But no, you can, if it's a great work of literature, you can gain a lot more value by taking the time to really digest it in pieces. And I have to just give an endorsement right here. Since we're getting towards the end of the year now, I'm almost done with the chapter a day Les Miserables project, which is also in the Read With Me app. So speaking of reading things in pieces, Les Miserables happens to fall into 365 chapters. So it's a very convenient thing to read a chapter a day. I think it was Robert Mayhew who pointed this out to me, said he had done this and suggested it as a practice. And so I've been writing little short daily commentaries on the chapters all year. And anyone who didn't do it this year, there's a new year just around the corner. You can pick up Les Mis. All you have to dedicate it. Usually the chapters are maybe 4 pages. Occasionally you come to one that's 30 and you're surprised, but it's a very modest commitment for what has to be, in the top 5 works of literature ever written. So
Yeah, well, the novels of Victor Hugo, I have to, I had come to love some of that before I'd even read Ayn Rand.
oh,
So maybe
okay.
there's a connection there between, but I love just about anything Hugo wrote is just, and I don't care if he was a Christian socialist. That I can completely get out of my head because he understands human greatness.
Yeah.
His characters hold their fates in the palms of their hands.
Mm.
He has this capacity to create these dramatic moments where characters come into collision in such a spectacular, breathtaking way that I cannot fail but be moved and excited and exalted by reading Victor Hugo, especially Les Mis. It is one of the most powerful, I have to say, I know this is the opposite of what Dr. Peikoff wanted us to do. Just focus on what I'm reading. That's great. But the experience of Les Mis is once in a lifetime.
Yeah.
Can be a life-altering experience just to see the world through Victor Hugo's exalted lens.
Yeah. Exalted, and I just think of him as having a spirit of humanity that just leaves you in love with the human potential. The humanity in it is just, I just feel it so deeply. So I think everybody needs to read Hugo.
Yeah. Any other questions, Dylan?
I think we got there. We do have a comment from Carolina who says, "Thank you. I appreciate these conversations. Also, thank you, Lisa, for creating Read With Me.
Indeed. Thank
Thank
you, Lisa.
Oh, it's truly a pleasure.
So I just want to end with a couple of notes. The number of projects that we're doing at Ayn Rand Center UK is constantly expanding. For example, Lisa's series on parenting, making parenting a joyful experience, is utterly fascinating. I urge people to check that out. We've got Don Watkins doing the communication boot camp still. On Sunday, we're starting a workshop on Leonard Peikoff's Understanding Objectivism course. If you're a subscriber and a member, you can participate both in Don's workshop on communications and our workshops on Leonard Peikoff extended Peikoff courses. And we're starting a whole new course. So please consider subscribing. There are a lot of perks to it. And we're doing, I think, some terrific work, if I can say so myself, at the Ayn Rand Center UK. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.